I knew my 16 years of sweat at Thornton Logistics had been reduced to a rounding error the second I walked into the Monday morning meeting. The conference room whiteboard, which usually displayed route maps and fuel cost charts, was covered in colorful sticky notes and a large vision board titled Logistics, but make it sexy. At the front of the room stood Julian Thornton. He was 32 years old, wore a tailored gray suit that cost more than my first pickup truck, and had his hair slicked back like a wet otter. He was pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly, pitching terms like strategic synergy waves and digital momentum cycles to a room of exhausted warehouse veterans who still balanced inventories with calculators older than their grandkids. I gave 16 years of my life to this company. I had started when we only had 3 warehouses and a dozen flatbeds. I was the one who kept the vendor chain together during national supply shortages. I was the one who talked a team of angry drivers out of walking off the job during a contract dispute, and I once caught a 7-figure billing discrepancy because a single decimal point looked suspicious in a handwritten ledger. But in the modern corporate world, none of that mattered. What mattered was a certificate from business school and a jawline like a poorly drawn triangle. I was holding a paper cup of burnt break-room coffee when Harvey Thornton, the founder and my longtime boss, stood up. Harvey was 76 years old now. His shoulders were stooped, and his face was carved with the deep lines of a man who had spent his youth loading cargo containers in freezing weather. He clapped his hands together, smiling warmly at the young man at the front. "Everyone, this is Julian," Harvey announced. "He will be joining us as co-strategist. He has some fresh perspectives on how to modernize our operations, and I want everyone to give him your full support." Co-strategist. It was a polite term for a shadow executive, a title designed to give the founder's son authority without any of the actual responsibility. Harvey did not even look at me when he said it. He just stared at the slide deck behind his son, looking relieved that he could finally hand off the burden of running the company. "Stanley," Harvey added, turning to me as the meeting wrapped up, "help Julian adjust. He will need your institutional knowledge to get his feet on the ground." Institutional knowledge is corporate speak for doing all the heavy lifting while the person in the suit takes the credit. I nodded and gave a polite smile. I did not say a word. I had learned long ago that when a new sheriff rides into town with shiny spurs, you do not stand in his way. You just step back and watch where he points his gun. My office was relocated the very next morning. Julian decided that his new operations strategy team needed my corner office because it had the best natural light for creative brainstorming. I was moved down to the basement to a small, windowless storage room right next to the main server racks. It was a cramped space that smelled of hot copper and ozone, and by 2 in the afternoon it felt like a sauna. My former team was reassigned to Julian's new operations optimization pod, leaving me alone with my spreadsheets and my files. But I stayed. I did not quit because I knew the company's real foundation was not built on slides or buzzwords. It was built on contracts, ledgers, and agreements. And I knew where the gaps were. Julian spent his first week firing 3 of our most reliable logistics coordinators. He replaced them with his former college roommates, who all wore matching fleece vests and spoke in a language that sounded like a marketing brochure. One of them, a young man named Keith, came down to my basement office on Wednesday, holding a printed invoice. He looked at me with a blank expression and asked where the entry button was on a paper ledger. I explained it to him slowly, using simple terms, while keeping my face completely expressionless. While they were busy renaming the communication channels to things like Hustle Harder, I spent my nights reviewing the old vendor files. That was when I found the escrow agreement for Vanguard Logistics. Vanguard was our primary cold chain carrier based in Omaha, Nebraska. They handled all our temperature-sensitive shipping. If Vanguard stopped rolling, our entire pharmaceutical and perishable distribution arm would collapse in 3 days flat. I pulled the physical contract from the steel filing cabinet. Buried on page 14 of the agreement was a dual-signature escrow clause. I had written it myself in 2018 when Vanguard was going through a compliance audit. It stated that the escrow holding account, which currently held $3,200,000 in carrier security funds, could not be released, moved, or altered without the joint signatures of both Stanley Vance and Harvey Thornton. Julian had not read the contract. He only read executive summaries. To him, the $3,200,000 was just a line item under holding assets, a pile of cash waiting for his strategic vision to unlock. I locked the drawer and took a sip of my cold coffee. The fuse was laid, and the boy was walking around with a box of matches. The changes at Thornton Logistics happened quickly, and not for the better. Julian's first major operational decision was to fire Rosemary, our 65-year-old senior invoice controller. Rosemary had been with the company for 12 years. She was a meticulous woman who could spot a fraudulent billing code or a double-billed shipping invoice faster than any automated auditing software we owned. Julian dismissed her during a 10-minute meeting on a Thursday afternoon, telling her that she was not digital forward and lacked the adaptive velocity required for the company's new trajectory. The announcement of her departure sent a chill through the office. Rosemary had been the quiet anchor of the finance floor, always arriving early to ensure the daily transport logs matched the bank transactions. The younger staff, who usually spent their time discussing corporate branding, went completely silent. They stared at their keyboards, suddenly realizing that the glossy promises of corporate synergy did not protect anyone from a 10-minute pink slip. I found Rosemary crying in the break room next to the vending machine that always swallowed quarters. She was holding a cardboard box containing her desktop calendar, a mug her grandson had painted, and 12 years of performance awards. When I confronted Julian about it in the hallway, he was sipping a green juice smoothie. "Disruption requires discomfort, Stanley," he said, flashing his bright white teeth and checking his smartwatch. "We need a team that aligns with our future growth strategy, not people who are stuck in the analog past." The next day, Julian officially appointed Keith as the Vice President of Logistics Coordination. Keith's qualifications included a failed financial podcast and a minor in media synergy from a mid-year university. Julian bought him a custom standing desk that cost more than Rosemary's annual dental insurance plan. Keith spent his first 2 days in the office, setting up a miniature, putting green in the middle of the department, and attempting to schedule mandatory mindfulness circles at 3 in the afternoon, right when our carrier dispatch schedules were at their peak. The basement office where I sat became a quiet refuge while the floors above me filled with new hires who spent their mornings whiteboarding phrases like brand logistics, empowerment. They treated me like an ancient artifact. One afternoon, a young strategist in a fleece vest stopped by my desk, looked at my open screen, and asked if I needed assistance learning how to navigate a cloud document. I looked up at her, kept my voice polite, and told her that I had been building relational databases since before she was out of diapers, and that if she did not leave my office, I would write a script to archive her email account into the next fiscal year. She left quickly, and I went back to my work. I was not just being petty, I was building a paper trail. Every time Julian made a decision that bypassed standard operating procedures, I forwarded the emails to my personal, password-protected cloud drive. I documented every warning I gave him, keeping a precise log of every transaction that looked suspicious. The first major breakdown came 3 weeks later. Julian decided to restructure our payment agreements with Vanguard Logistics. Historically, we paid Vanguard on a strict net 10 rolling structure, which was tied to specific temperature sensor verification milestones. This was a critical safety measure. If a refrigeration unit failed during transport, we held the payment until the insurance claim was resolved. Julian, in his corporate brilliance, decided that we should pay Vanguard the entire quarterly contract amount up front. He claimed this would build rapport and demonstrate trust, which he called a key driver of modern supply chain relationships. I laid out the risks in a formal report. I showed him that paying up front would violate our cargo insurance policy, leaving us liable for any spoiled shipments. I explained that we would lose all leverage if Vanguard experienced equipment failures. Julian glanced my report for 3 seconds before tossing it onto his desk. "Stanley, you are thinking like an accountant," he said with a sigh. "We are a bold playmaker now. We do not operate out of fear. We operate out of partnership." I did not argue. I simply replied, "Understood, bold is good," and went back to my basement office. I copied my report, his response, and the insurance policy details to my secure drive under a folder I named When It All Burns. Within 5 days, Vanguard sent a formal letter expressing concern over the proposed contract amendments. They pointed out that an upfront payment structure would conflict with their federal cargo licensing requirements. Julian did not consult the legal department. Instead, he sent them a reply containing a digital animation of Jim Carrey, smiling and waving. The logistics coordinator at Vanguard, a practical man who had been running trucks for 30 years, immediately forwarded the email to our legal department with a single sentence. "Is this a joke?" I watched the email chain grow longer and more hostile from my basement desk. I kept my mouth shut and my fingers typing. I was not going to stop the train from hitting the wall. I was just making sure I was not sitting in the driver's seat when it happened. The summons to the executive conference room came on a Friday afternoon. The room was dominated by a large mahogany table and a taxidermy deer head on the wall that always looked as though it disapproved of our quarterly profit margins. The walls were lined with framed photographs of Harva standing next to cargo ships and warehouses, relics of a time when logistics was measured in steel and sweat rather than digital clicks. Harvey Thornton was sitting at the head of the table, looking at a sheet of paper. He had a glass of water in front of him, and he looked older than he had a month ago. His hand shook slightly as he set down his reading glasses. "Sit down, Stanley," Harvey said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. "I wanted to check in and see how you were holding up with the transition." "Different," I said, keeping my voice neutral as I sat down. "It is a new environment," Harvey sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know Julian is aggressive. He has a lot of big ideas, and he wants to move fast. But he has to stretch his wings, Stanley. He has to learn how to lead this company." "At the expense of our carriers?" I asked quietly. Harvey looked out the window at the trucks lining up at the loading docks. "We have to let him make his own mistakes, Stanley. That is the only way he will learn. If something breaks, we will fix it. That is what we have always done." I stared at him. I realized then that Harvey was not trying to solve the problem. He was trying to comfort himself. He knew his son was making poor choices, but he was too tired to fight him, and his guilt as a father was overriding his judgment as a chief executive officer. He wanted me to tell him it was going to be fine, to validate his choice to hand over his legacy to a boy who had never loaded a pallet in his life. "If the roof collapses, Harvey, you do not just fix it," I said softly. "Sometimes you have to rebuild the whole foundation." Harvey did not reply. He just gave me a tired nod and said he appreciated my loyalty. I walked out of the conference room and went back down to the basement. The air was cooler down there, and the hum of the servers sounded like a steady mechanical reminder of what was real. On my desk was the final contract renewal packet for Vanguard Logistics. Legal had routed it to me because they still assumed I was managing the accounts, even though Julian had officially stripped me of my authority. I flipped through the pages until I reached page 14. There it was, the carrier escrow retention agreement. The language was identical to the version I had drafted in 2018. The $3,200,000 held in the carrier security account could only be released or modified with the joint signatures of Stanley Vance and Harvey Thornton. Because Julian had bypassed the finance department and spent all his time in marketing sinks, nobody had updated the banking signatures. The bank still recognized me as the primary fiduciary authority for that account. To the system, Julian's digital signature meant absolutely nothing. I sat in my chair for a long time watching the cursor blink on my screen. I could have pointed this out to Julian. I could have sent an email to legal and had the signatures updated to reflect the new management structure. Instead, I opened the system terminal. I accessed the secondary security settings for the Vanguard escrow account. I added a compliance verification trigger to the release protocol. This trigger required a full audit of all vendor correspondence and signature timestamps before the escrow funds could be authorized for release. Under Delaware corporation law and general contract principles, a joint signatory has the fiduciary duty to verify the legitimacy of any transaction before signing off. By adding this trigger, I was legally obligating the bank to audit the transactions if anyone tried to move the funds unilaterally. If they tried to bypass the protocol, the bank would freeze the account automatically. The bank would see any unauthorized attempt as a breach of contract, freezing the account to protect the assets. I saved the changes and encrypted the configuration file. I stored the access keys on a flash drive that I kept in my pocket. I labeled the folder on my network drive Moss Contingency. I went home that evening, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and listened to some old jazz records. For the first time in months, the tightness in my chest was gone. I was no longer a bystander watching a train wreck. I had just laid the tracks that would lead the train exactly where it needed to go. The first crack in Julian's structure appeared on a rainy Tuesday morning. Mallory, a junior compliance analyst who had been hired 6 months before, knocked on my basement office door. She looked pale and was clutching a folder to her chest like it was a shield. She kept looking over her shoulder as if she expected Julian or one of his assistants to appear in the hallway. "Stanley," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with anxiety. "Do you have a minute? It is about the vendor approvals." I waved her into the office and closed the door. She set the folder on my desk and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were 5 vendor authorization forms for payments to a new digital marketing agency run by Julian's college friend, incorporated just 3 weeks prior. I looked at the approval signatures on the forms. They had my initials digitalized on the sign-off lines, along with the initials of the head of our legal department. "I did not approve these," I said, my voice flat, my eyes tracking the signatures. "I know," Mallory said, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted her glasses. I checked the system logs. The approvals were uploaded from Julian's laptop during the weekend, late on Sunday night. He bypassed the compliance queue entirely. He forged your digital signatures to push the payments through before the system could flag them. Under California Penal Code Section 470, forging a signature on a contract is a felony. As a regulated pharmaceutical logistics provider, forging compliance records also violated federal safety laws, putting our operating licenses at risk. "Does anyone else know about this?" I asked. Closing the folder to stop her hands from shaking, Mallory shook her head quickly. "No, I came straight to you. I did not know who else to trust, and I was afraid that if I uploaded it to the standard ticketing portal, it would get routed to Julian's new operations team." I looked at the young woman. She was 28 years old, had a mountain of student loans, and was terrified of losing her job. I closed the folder and returned it to the young woman. "Take a sick day tomorrow, Mallory," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Save these files to a personal flash drive tonight, clear your local cache, and let me handle the rest. You are not going down for Julian's mess." She nodded, looking relieved, and left my office. I immediately copied the network logs showing the weekend access to my secure drive, making sure to capture the internet protocol address of Julian's home router. That afternoon, I met with my attorney, a sharp contract lawyer named Walter who had been advising me for a decade. We met at a quiet steakhouse downtown that still had leather booths and smelled of wood smoke. Walter sat in the corner booth, a legal pad open beside his steak. I laid out the situation, the dual signature escrow, the forged approvals, and the compliance violations. Walter reviewed the documents while cutting his steak, his face hardening as he read. "This is clean, Stanley," he said, looking up over his glasses. "The forged approvals violate California Penal Code Section 470. If they touch the escrow using these, it is void ab initio. The transaction is completely invalid because there was never mutual consent or authorized authority. They cannot bind the company to an agreement built on a felony." He handed me a set of documents from his briefcase. "I have drafted a retroactive indemnity agreement and a file ownership declaration. It states that all compliance audits and security protocols you created are your intellectual property and cannot be altered or accessed without your direct authorization. Sign these." I signed the papers. If Julian wanted to play corporate games, he was going to find out that the real rules were written by lawyers, not social media influencers. The climax came on Thursday during the third quarter Momentum Summit. Julian gathered the entire operations and finance departments in the main conference room. There were bagels, color-coded folders, and a large screen displaying a presentation titled Vanguard Reallocation Strategy. The room was filled with the low hum of nervous chatter. Julian took the floor, pacing with high energy, his voice echoing through the glass walls. "We are redirecting the $3,200,000 currently sitting idle in the Vanguard escrow account," he announced, pointing to a slide with a large graphic of a truck. "We are going to use these funds to launch a viral branding campaign. We have already signed an agency that will film promotional videos with transport trucks." I sat at the end of the table, my laptop open. Julian walked over to my chair and leaned down, his voice low but loud enough for the nearby staff to hear. "Stanley, initiate the transfer. Move the $3,200,000 out of the escrow account and into the marketing account today." I looked at him. Every eye in the room was on me. I knew the escrow was locked behind my compliance trigger. If I refused openly, he would try to fire me on the spot and have the IT department override my access before I could secure the evidence. Instead, I nodded. "I will. Log in and begin the routing process," I said. I opened the portal. I routed $500,000 of non-restricted operations, cash to the marketing account to make it look like the transfer had started. Then, I accessed the Vanguard escrow account and placed the remaining $2,700,000 into a strict compliance hold pattern. I clicked the final confirmation button. The system locked the escrow. The trap was set, and Julian had just stepped directly into the center of it. The final confrontation happened on a chilly Tuesday morning. Julian had called an all-hands transparency alignment session. In the glass-walled conference room, every department head was present, sitting in quiet discomfort. Julian stood at the front, his laptop projecting a slide titled Operational Roadblocks. Below the title was my name in bold black letters. "We are facing a critical delay in our strategic rollout," Julian announced, pointing at the screen. "Stanley Vance has unilaterally blocked the release of the Vanguard Logistics escrow funds. He is using outdated contract clauses to obstruct our growth and limit our market reach." He turned to me, his expression a mix of anger and performance. "Stanley, you need to release those funds now. This company is moving forward, and you are holding us back." I looked around the room. I saw Keith nodding eagerly, while the older department heads kept their eyes glued to their notebooks, unwilling to get caught in the crossfire. I stood up slowly, adjusting my suit jacket. "The Vanguard escrow is locked because you attempted to redirect carrier security funds without the required dual signatures," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "Those funds are legally restricted. Bypassing the contract is a breach of fiduciary duty under corporate law, and the bank will not authorize the transaction without both required signatories." Julian's face flushed red, his jaw tightening. He stepped toward me, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Sit down and be grateful, Stanley. You have been running this department like a personal fiefdom for 16 years, but your time is up. Authorize the transfer now, or you will be escorted from the building by security." I looked at him, then down at my laptop. I did not sit down. Instead, pressed a single key on my keyboard, officially withdrawing my signature authorization from the escrow system. The screen flashed a bright red alert, "Transaction aborted. Escrow frozen." Julian gasped, staring at his tablet. "What did you just do?" Before he could scream, the conference room door opened and Harvey Thornton walked in. He looked pale, and he was holding a blue folder that I had delivered to his office an hour ago. The room went dead silent as Harvey walked to the head of the table. He did not look at his son. He looked at me, his eyes tired but focused. "Stanley, is this accurate?" Harvey asked, his voice shaking slightly as he tapped the folder. I nodded. "In that folder, Harvey, you will find the transaction logs proving that Julian forged my digital initials to authorize payments to his marketing associates. That is a direct violation of California Penal Code Section 470. You will also find the files detailing the constructive termination of Rosemary, firing a 65-year-old employee to replace her with unqualified associates, while stripping her pension benefits constitutes elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions. Code Section 15,610.30. The room went completely silent. Julian looked from me to his father, his confidence evaporating in real time. "Dad, he is lying," Julian stammered, his voice rising in panic. "I was just trying to streamline the approvals. He is trying to sabotage my campaign because he hates the new strategy. Harvey opened the folder, his eyes scanning the signatures and the system's logs. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Harvey stood up, his face an expression of profound exhaustion and defeat. He looked at his son with a mixture of sadness and anger. "You did not build this, Julian. You do not know how to run it. You have put the entire company at legal risk, and you have violated the trust of our carriers." "Dad, it was for the campaign," Julian pleaded, his hands open. "We needed the momentum. The board wanted to see growth." I picked up my leather briefcase. I had already printed my resignation letter. I laid it on the mahogany table in front of Harvey, right next to the blue folder. "My resignation is effective immediately," I said. "You will find all my transition notes on the secure server, but the Vanguard escrow remains locked. Without my signature, the bank will not release a single dollar until a full independent compliance audit is completed by external investigators." I turned and walked toward the door. No one tried to stop me. Keith was staring at his standing desk, and Julian was looking down at his polished leather shoes, his face completely pale. By Friday morning, Vanguard Logistics had pulled all their trucks from our routes. They cited breach of carrier agreement and contract instability. Without our primary cold chain carrier, Thornton Logistics was paralyzed. The board of directors launched an emergency investigation into Julian's forged approvals, and the local news was already reporting on the sudden shutdown of our shipping lines. The stock price began to drop, and the office was filled with auditors. I did not watch the collapse. I spent my Friday morning sitting on the deck of my house, drinking hot coffee and watching the autumn leaves drift across the yard. I had given 16 years of my life to that company, and I had built a system that worked. When they tried to replace competence with vanity, they forgot that a building cannot stand without its foundation. And I was the one who walked away with the blueprint. You are the real heroes of the office. Thanks for listening to this story. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next corporate breakdown. Or the coffee machine in your break room might just go on strike.